your daddy never held you like he should. Maybe your mama just held on the best she could. Every soul has a secret. Give it away or keep it. But yesterday's gone, so tell me why. You carry the weight of the world. It's breaking you down on your back like a boulder. Before it's too late, get rid of it, girl. Get it off of your shoulder. I know you've been used, but you gotta lose the weight of the world.
I saw you sitting at the center of a circle. Everybody wanted something from you. I saw you sitting there. I saw you swaying to the rhythm of the music. Got you playing, got you praying to the voice inside you. I saw you swaying there. I don't care what you wanna be. I go back so far, I'm in front of me. It doesn't matter what they say. They're giving the game away. Hey, hey. I can see the world tonight. Look into the future. See it in a different light. I can see the world tonight. Someone's driving at 4:50, and his friends are so wild. They're still in their stick shifters. They're feeling much more style, but I found it's all up to what you value down to where you are. Little sweet on the pain you've gone through, getting where you are. It's all up to what you value in your motor car. Little rest on what it cost you, getting where you are. It's what you value. In the middle of the night, in the middle of the night, I call your name. Oh, Yoko. Oh, Yoko. My love will turn you on.
Welcome to the Friends of Dan Music Podcast. I'm Dan Miles. Today, we're going to be logging in yet another entry to our ever-popular and ongoing Beatles series. Beatle author and now Beatle podcaster Robert Rodriguez is returning to the show to talk about a book he's written chronicling the solo careers of the four Beatles from 1970 through the untimely and tragic death of John Lennon in 1980. Joining me on the phone from Chicago is Robert Rodriguez. Welcome back.
Great to be here, Dan, as always.
Well, I know that in the past you've been a frequent podcast guest. So apart from the obvious lure of the big bucks, what inspired you to transition over to the other side and become a podcast host yourself?
Well, it sort of started as a thought experiment because it occurred to me that through the years there's these very deep conversations that I've gotten into with my Beatle geek friends, mostly people you wouldn't have heard of. But then a few years back when I met Richard Buskin in the course of my publishing career, we discovered that, it was almost like, even though he's a few years older and is a London native before he came to America 20 years ago, it was a parallel life in terms of being familiar with a lot of the same books, certainly the same Beatle bootlegs, and just we spoke the same language, in short. So, and we also had some opinions that largely fell in line, but some we were a little at odds with our differing perspectives, but it was all good. And, we would have many a phone call where we'd just be, digesting something in Beatle history or something new, anything, any Beatle-related subject. And so it occurred to me somewhere along the line, hey, talking like this at length and, maybe skirting the edges of insider baseball in the geekdom of Beatleness, wouldn't it be cool maybe to put this out there for public consumption and see if anybody bites? And that was sort of the thought. And I've got a good friend who has a studio that regularly does this sort of thing, lots of audio and video production. So we had the access. We certainly are not short on material. Mm-hmm. And so we decided to have a go at it. And it was about a year and a half ago, I guess, late 2013, when we first started something about the Beatles.
Yeah, your co-host, Richard Buskin, he's also a professional researcher and Beatle author, so you guys can't really slip things by each other. Dubious facts will always be challenged. So, you keep each other on your toes. There's some equality there. It isn't like, anybody's dominant. And Richard has, the English fans' perspective, which counterbalances nicely with your own American perspective, because, there are some critical differences. As we all learned when the Beatles canon first came out on CD in the 80s with these crazy track listings we'd never seen before. Let's move on to Solo in the 70s, John, Paul, George, Ringo, 1970 to 1980. That's the full title of the book. Now, whether you measure from the first session with Ringo in 1962 through the Abbey Road sessions in 1969, or whether you're more generous and you start with, let's say, Tony Sheridan sessions in June 1961 and then take it all the way through those touch-up sessions on some of the Let It Be material in early 1970, you're still talking about a Beatle recording career that lasted less than a decade.
Right.
Meanwhile, Paul and Ringo have been solo artists for 45 years. Mm-hmm. So we're going to have to deal with the inevitable comparisons of their solo work to the Beatles canon. Do you think there was an element of denial on their part in that regard? Was it realistic for them to assume that the public would just forget about their Beatle past and perceive them as something new?
Well, I think that they certainly were laboring under the shadow of their collective past, and it did become kind of irksome when that would be what people wanted to talk about, and inevitably when they'd be promoting their latest project, when are you guys getting back together would always surface as a question. Only after 1980 did the Beatles begun to be spoken of in past tense. Yeah. Up until John's death, they were still, even though they hadn't done anything in 10 years, thought of as something that could happen again any day. Mm-hmm. And after that, they just passed into history. And it's like, well, clearly that's never going to happen now.
You included a timeline at the end of the book at 166 pages. It's almost a book within itself. It spans every month of every year from 1970 to 1980. It isn't just about the Beatles. It's like you said, the color, the vibe of the time. You indicate which singles and which albums by any artist were topping the U.S. charts that month. Also, which albums and books of note were released that month. And as I read through the timeline, I was struck by a number of things. Now, the first thing was your July 1970 entry where you mentioned Ringo being the first Beatle to turn 30. And you think, the Beatles are done. And Ringo turns 30. It just reminds you of how young those guys were, when they were doing all this work. I mean, George didn't turn 30 until they were 3 years gone. The visual support in the timeline is cool, and you included a TV guide close-up for John's Imagine special. I'd forgotten about those things. The show description goes into comprehensive detail about who plays what for the entire thing, so you can forget about an element of surprise. It tells you who all the guests are, what songs they play, and in what order.
Yeah. like kind of gleaned from a press release or something.
I seemed to detect a sort of perverse pleasure you were taking in reporting the poor chart performances of Yoko Ono's various releases. Yoko releases such and such, which peaks at number 193 on the charts,
Right.
or in some cases fails to chart at all.
Yeah, did not chart. Yeah. This is the thing about the timeline, and as you point out, it does take up a good maybe third of the book. I thought it was really, really important at this distance, especially for people who didn't live through the 70s, to understand the context that they were producing, the 30 albums of original material between the four of them, between 1970 and 1980. What else was going on in the musical world? Who else was in the charts? And you could see how the decade started out with a bit of, ex-Beatles supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly with All Things Must Pass, and, they all had hit singles in 1971. And as the decade goes on, the musical tastes change. You see their, hit-making abilities, except for Paul, who constantly was striving for that, kind of diminish.
Now let's break it down and talk about each Beatles solo work individually. Let's go ahead and start with Ringo. Of the four of them, he was the most in need of some outside assistance, simply because he was never a prolific songwriter. He was a decent vocalist when given something, of quality to work with, but primarily he was a drummer. And while there is a precedent for a drummer to be a band leader, it's more the exception than the rule. So while some of the others were sniping at each other in the immediate aftermath of the Beatles' breakup, Ringo remained on good enough terms with all three of them to solicit their involvement with his early solo work. But before we get to that, we have to talk about his decision to launch his solo career in a pretty odd way. I mean, what's your opinion of his Sentimental Journey album, both in terms of the musical content and the sort of career path aspect?
Well, it was definitely along the line of what had been going on as far as outside projects with the Beatles. At the time he set out to record that album, which was right after Abbey Road in the fall of 1969, he had no way of knowing if the Beatles were going to make another album at that time or not.
Yeah.
But it was a period of indulgence where certainly John, with the stuff he'd been cranking out with Yoko to that point, and both John and George had put out those experimental albums on the Zappo label.
Yeah.
Stuff that I don't know how seriously George took electronic sound, but seriously enough to put it out with his name on it. More seriously, he took the Wonderwall project, which was this great collection of East-West stuff he did for that art film that Ringo played on. And so I think Ringo saw it as his turn. He was between film projects at the time. That had been his primary indulgence to that point outside the group. And when you look at just the idea of it, and I don't think he's ever spoken of what prompted the idea other than to say he wanted to do something for his parents, for his mother. Because when he was a child and he wasn't in the hospital, his mother, who was a barmaid, tended to bring her little toddler along. And, Ringo was in this very social, musical environment, and sing-alongs were a big thing. You're talking... the first 15 years of his life, rock and roll didn't really exist, so it was pop standards and big band things, and that was his musicality to that point. He picked up on a lot of jazz stuff, and, all this was the stuff that was his musical roots. And so here's this break in the Beatles' career, and he gets the idea, of the rock and roll 60s generation, I'm going to go back a generation and record some standards. Now, you can make the case, well, Ringo, you're a great country singer, but I don't know that this kind of stuff, this Tony Bennett, Frank Sinatra type pop is really, suited to your skill set. But he did it out of love, and certainly he was the first from, rock and roll to do this kind of project, which then became kind of a staple ever afterwards. Nelson, I think, did his in 73, A Touch of Schmilson in the Night, and, with better results, arguably, but certainly Ringo brought in some top talent to do the arranging on his album. Everybody from Quincy Jones to George Martin to Paul McCartney. And so it was kind of foresighted of him to come up with the concept, even if it wasn't probably the most superlative example of the genre.
No.
And then he follows that, purely by happenstance of working on George's All Things Must Pass album. They bring in Pete Drake from Nashville, who was a producer as well as a pedal steel guitar player who played on a few tracks on All Things Must Pass. And it was Ringo who sent his car to pick up Pete from the airport. Pete's in it, and he sees, cassette tapes laying around of country music. And, it starts a conversation wow, you're a big fan of country music. I had no idea. And Ringo's like, yeah. He goes, I would love to record some someday, but I just haven't got the time for it. And Pete's like, well, just I can hook you up, and we can knock it out in a week.
Mm-hmm.
I'll line up the sessions in the studios and get the material, and you just come in, pick the songs, and we'll have you in and out of there in 1 week. And that's exactly what happened.
Well, when Bobby Whitlock was on the show, he took credit for being the guy who recommended to George and All Things Must Pass. And what you really ought to do is get Pete Drake to play steel on this. And his comment was like a couple days later, Pete Drake walks in. I go, you got the Beatles and you've got Phil Spector. They can make those kind of things happen.
Yeah.
My feeling about it is, maybe Ringo should have done one or two, recorded it, gave it to his mom, and said Merry Christmas, and kept it as a private collection matter.
Right.
Because did the fans of the Beatles' late '60s material really want to hear him bust out with a version of "Love Is a Many Splendored Thing"? I mean, he was a member of the most innovative rock band of all time, and now he wants to go be Percy Faith.
Well, unfortunately, Zapple had been deactivated by that time. Otherwise, it would have fit the paperback throwaway concept wonderfully.
I think the fact that, Beaucoup of Blues, both pronunciations you hear, the country album he did, and this one, it's almost like they don't exist in terms of, he doesn't talk about them particularly, he never does any material in his live set from them. But on one level, I respect him for doing what he wanted to do. He wanted to do a Sinatra-type album. He wanted to do a country album. He went and did it. Great. And there's a good point you make about he didn't know if the Beatles were over or not. Maybe this was just a little indulgence and not the beginning of his quote-unquote solo career. But I think as a practical matter, we can agree that his quote-unquote solo career really begins with the It Don't Come Easy single.
Yeah.
Now this is his own voice as a solo artist. And it's a great song and a great recording and a hit. Of course, his first full-length original album in '73 was a great success. His follow-up, Goodnight Vienna, in '74 was solid. What point do you think he sort of lost his way? Because some of his subsequent releases seem a bit confusing even to him, let alone his fan base. He seems sort of disconnected from his own material.
And by all accounts, that is exactly the case, is that, this was the period before he dried out. So there was a lot of hard partying going on. And I've heard that from everybody around him. It's like you don't know the half of it. There was the public things that went on, like when he shaved his head one day in 1976. But, it was a time of nonstop. It was almost like a reaction, like a post-traumatic stress, self-medicating from the tumultuous Beatle years. And, George had his own period of bottoming out as well for various reasons. But it was like they were doing this, making records because they were contractually obligated to, because it was what you did, not because I've got a great idea for a concept or for some songs that I'm writing or things that I want to record. It was what you did because that was what you did.
Not to interrupt you, but the thing that just occurs to me at this moment is you think of John, Paul, and George, they're kind of leaders, particularly in terms of their own art, where Ringo is more of a follower. He was more like, you bring me something and I'll contribute to it. So it makes me think he's a person who could be led astray, by a producer or a writer who says, hey, Ringo the Fourth is a great idea. Where John, Paul, George, if they have a strong feeling about the material, they'll say, yeah, no thanks. I don't want to do an 80s album full of synthesizers and white noise and drum machines. No, thank you. I'm not saying that's what Ringo the Fourth is. I'm just saying is that Ringo seems more like he's more trusting of someone and maybe more likely to make a mistake. So let me just run down, he finished the 70s out after Goodnight with Vienna. Ringo's Rotogravure, even with John and George contributing to that one, it really wasn't enough to save it. Ringo the Fourth, Bad Boy. In the 80s, all he did was Stop and Smell the Roses and Old Wave. Then 9 years go by, and he does Time Takes Time. I also understand he had trouble finding a label at certain parts in his career that wanted to put him out. They feel you might be an ex-Beatle, but your sales figures don't impress us. Time Takes Time was 92. Vertical Man was 98. Then in the 2000s, he's been pretty consistent, both in terms of regular releases and pretty quality stuff. Ringo Rama was 2003, Choose Love 2005, Liverpool 8 2008, Why Not 2010, Ringo 2012, well, that came out in 2012, and Postcards from Paradise in 2015. I think from about there's some good stuff on Time Takes Time, Vertical Man. I think Ringo Rama is a pretty lively comeback, and it's been pretty decent since then. So the floundering period, I hadn't made the connection, but you're right. He probably was like trying to battle his demons and whatnot and meet his professional obligations. In recent years, he's taken to referencing his pre-Beatles personal history in songs like Liverpool 8 and The Other Side of Liverpool and In Liverpool and Rory and the Hurricanes. Do you think you might have overdone the Hard Times Before Fame theme at this point?
Well, I think as you get older and your perspective on your life changes, you start getting more thoughtful about your past, and you're just kind of processing it all through grown-up eyes. I think that is probably something that he is trying to get a handle on. On the one hand, he said that, I'm not going to ever write a book because all people want to talk about is the 7 years I was in the Beatles. That's all people care about. And he goes, anything I have to say, I'll say in my music. And I think, in a way, that's what he's been doing.
Yeah.
You could say that he's revisiting the same well over and over again, but I think, each time it means something different to him.
Interesting.
And then, of course, in the past year or so, he put together that book of photographs. And I think it's another way that he's sort of coming to terms with, something that must be such a profound double-edged sword to him. On the one hand, he's got such great pride and love for, his three brothers that he was in the band with and what they accomplished and how they changed the world.
Yeah.
But, can you imagine being 75 years old and all people ever want to talk to you about is something you did when you were in your 20s?
Well, I get that, but it's like I just said, like 5 or 6 different songs about that same time period. But, hey, like you said, for him personally, maybe one is, even a difference of a year or two. Like, oh, this is about, 58, and this is about 59. To us, it's like big deal, but to him, it might be significant. Well, while he doesn't have as many big hits as his fellow ex-bandmates do, there's several songs that everyone associates with him in his post-Beatles phase. So what I'd like to get from you now is a song suggestion of a lesser-known Ringo track that a casual fan might not know, but you think is worthy of some attention. So have you got maybe a hidden Ringo gem to share with us?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of his albums, even the ones that have gotten the worst critical reviews, have usually got something worthy on them, even if it's just a track or two where everything's clicking on all cylinders. And even Ring of the Four, they'd say there's probably a few good tracks on there. Some
Sure.
people really love that album. I'm not one of them, but I would go back though a couple albums. I think for the 2 full-length Apple albums that he made, the Ringo album, which is a big blockbuster, I think in the context of the times, the fact that he had the 3 ex-Beatles on there, not all on the same track, but it was the closest thing we would get to a reunion in John's lifetime. Gave it that actual, that extra bit of Beatle magic to it. But between that and Ringo, or Goodnight Vienna, which came out the following year, he has always said he preferred that album, that he thought it was more cohesive, and that he was, more adept at getting what he wanted on it in terms of material and overall production. He preferred that one. And I think if that album had come out first, it would be the one people would be falling all over themselves for. But it was like it had the detriment of coming second, and maybe people saw it too much as a repeat or not enough as an advance. But to me, a great gem off that is the song "Easy for Me,"
Oh, yeah.
which was written by Harry Nilsson, who was his BFF at the time. And to me, it's one of these rare things where he's not kind of inhabiting the Ringo persona that a lot of his charm shines through on, like an I'm the Greatest that John wrote for the Ringo album. It's him as balladeer, which you might, raise your eyebrows a bit at, but this is him returning to Goodnight territory from the White Album,
Yeah.
where, it's got some string orchestration going on, it's a, piano-based ballad, and it just he delivers it so well. He really, wrapped his head around it, and I think that's something like, man, when I was doing the research for the 2.0 book, it's like, how come people don't know more about this song?
No, that's a perfect choice because it is one that people don't know, and it's, like I just said, worthy of some attention. It sounds like a Gershwin song from a musical, like Porgy and Bess or something.
Yeah, almost like a Randy Newman quality to it.
Yeah, well, let's let everybody listen to it. From Goodnight Vienna, 1974, here's a Harry Nilsson song called Easy for Me.
Nobody loved her, it was easy to see. That made it easy for me. The boys never fought over her company. that made it easy for me. Love so bright could only blind us. How could reason hope to find us hiding in the Milky Way without a star to shine the way? Castles fell from the tears in our eyes that made it easier to see. Now the dream's over and I realize that makes it easy for me.
Lyrically, that's an interesting twist on the easy concept. You know, he went from "it don't come easy" to "easy for me." I'm sure Nielsen was thinking about that. Well, that's a good one. As far as my own Ringo selection, there are a few that come to mind. "Free Drinks" from his "Choose Love" album is a good one. It has a nice vibe and energy to it. I also like "Tonight" from his Bad Boy album and "Give It a Try" from Liverpool 8, just because I think they have catchy melodies. You know, I find them playing in my head sometimes, and they're well suited to the particular quality of his voice, which I do like. I like Ringo's voice a lot. I mean, some of the Beatles songs were better suited for him than any of the other three, particular tunes, I think.
Oh, definitely.
But as for my actual pick, ironically enough, also a Harry Nilsson composition, Ringo definitely isn't disconnected from this one. Both musically and lyrically, it's right in his wheelhouse. From his 1981 Stop and Smell the Roses album, here's Richard Starkey with "Drumming Is My Madness."
Drumming is my madness. Drumming is my business. Drumming is my pleasure. Drumming makes me happy. Drumming makes me lose control. Drumming makes me rock and roll, yeah. Wax me now, wrist off.
Well, now let's talk about the other former Beatle who's still active today, Sir Paul. He kicked off his solo career with a homemade do-it-yourself production where he played all the instruments himself. Fortunately for him, some of the material was strong enough to, overcome the questionable production value. Songs like Maybe I'm Amazed and Every Night are still in his live set today. There are also songs like Teddy Boy and Junk that were rejected by the Beatles. Now, if you call your song junk, you're kind of asking for it. You guys want to work on some junk? He followed that one up with his much more polished Ram album in 1971. We mentioned Ringo's artistic faux pas, of putting out genre material that was, not likely to connect with his current fans. So let's consider Paul's own fan alienating decision, which was to take his wife, who had little to no musical experience, and place her front and center in both the studio and live settings of his music. I think we can agree that her keyboard contributions never really amounted to much, but her vocal harmonies did become a signature aspect of the Wings sound. So how would you assess the wisdom of that decision of Paul's?
Well, it certainly, on musical grounds, it's pretty indefensible. And I think it was very striking that you cannot view it as anything other than a reaction to what John was doing, so conscientiously replacing Paul as his musical partner with Yoko. And I think Paul, there was very much an aspect of his personality, well, two can play at that game. And beyond the statement he was making by making Linda, who absolutely had no rock star aspirations at all, and out of sheer love for Paul had to take so much grief from both fans and critics and just suffer it. I think that Paul genuinely needed somebody who loved him and who he trusted to be his emotional and psychological support during that time. He was a mess by all accounts in the end of 1969 when John had told him he was leaving the Beatles. And, that really devastated him, and he bottomed out till Linda kind of pushed him into, getting out of bed and put the bottle down and start making music again. And so once he did start from scratch with Wings, he had Linda as sort of his partner for the first two albums. And you listen to the harmonies that, granted, he came up with a lot of the ideas and she just, fulfilled them, but she also came up with ideas of her own as she started warming to the whole thing.
True.
That album is full of some great harmony parts, the Ram album. And then once Wings was formed and her and Denny Lane would be doing all the oohing and ahhing, that was like a signature sound of that band, unique from any other act on earth. So, her contributions definitely gave a flavor to Paul's post-Beatle music.
Well, I think it's safe to say that of the four ex-Beatles, Paul was the most ambitious musically in terms of blanketing all genres. He released some driving rockers, some soppy ballads, some more of his old-timey granny music. He did experiments like Rockestra. He did his Liverpool Oratorio, which might have been a little too ambitious. He followed up Ram with Wildlife and Red Rose Speedway, which had their moments but were fairly uneven. Then, as we said, Band on the Run is considered to be the turning point where he hit his stride as a solo artist. But, I know Paul wanted to create the impression that he formed a band called Wings, but did you ever really buy into that concept that it was a band and not really just, Paul?
I think Paul kind of waxed and waned on that himself. I think that he would loudly protest, no, this is a band. And there were times when he came close to meaning it. If you look at the albums like Venus and Mars and Speed of Sound, which was arguably their peak as that particular lineup of five individuals, who then went on to do the Wings Over the World tour, Wings Over America and then around the world. He's being a lot more democratic than he ever would again, allowing other songwriting contributions and lead vocals to be among the mix.
Yeah.
And even if he wrote the song himself and Denny Lane sang it or something, at least they were given a little spotlight. And I think once that band imploded, it went back to, well, we're calling it Wings, but still my hand puppet. And that's the way it was until it played out and imploded in 1980.
So he finished out the 70s with London Town and Back to the Egg. He did the more experimental McCartney 2 in 1980, prior to the death of his old partner. Then he commenced the post-Lennon era with Tug of War in 1982 and Pipes of Peace in 83, which saw him team up with Stevie Wonder and Michael Jackson. So what did you think of that era?
Not my favorite. I think he would, explore lower depths than that as the decade went on before bouncing back with Flowers in the Dirt. I was never a fan of the Michael Jackson collaborative stuff, and I thought Ebony and Ivory was really just kind of abysmal. I wondered what Stevie was thinking recording that. But I thought that What's That You're Doing, which started out apparently as a jam, that had a lot more grit and punch to it. That I would have liked to have seen if they explored more in that direction.
Sure.
They could have, repurposed the words to something, civil rights oriented, and kept the title.
Yeah.
And it would have been a really powerful anthemic thing rather than that, Hallmark card that ended up coming out.
And I wonder how Paul felt about, you mentioned all the competition that went on between him and John. John can't compete with him anymore as of Tug of War. John's gone.
Right.
But interestingly, he returns to George Martin, doesn't he? George Martin produced Tug of War.
Yes. And that was really one of the nails in the coffin of Wings, because originally they had started out, running over the material in the studio, and then George Martin was the one who pulled Paul aside and said, you really don't need these guys. Why don't we just cast each song, the way we see fit?
And Paul should have said, I never needed those guys, George. Should have just said. Now, in 1984 came his quote-unquote vanity project, Give My Regards to Broad Street, for which he filmed himself, re-recording some of his favorite songs and also some largely forgettable newer material. It was basically just a really expensive home movie where he and his friends could play dress-up. Although The Long and Winding Road with the saxophone is kind of neat. No More Lonely Nights is great. I don't mean that one by the forgettable. I mean, was it No Values, I'm Not Such a Bad Boy, whatever.
Yeah,
Totally forgettable. Press to Play came out in 1986, and then in 1989 he released Flowers in the Dirt. I'm particularly nostalgic about that one, both because I like the material on the album and also because I saw that tour. First time I'd seen any ex-Beatle live. I'm not the world's biggest Elvis Costello fan, but I do think working together was a really good thing for Paul.
You really can point at that as the moment he finally collaborated with somebody that wasn't, enthralled to his legend and was going to tell him what's what in a way you hadn't seen since Lennon was around and working with him. And even though it's only like 4 songs on the album, plus the stuff that ended up on Elvis's album, they really created something great together.
Most of the tracks on the album I liked, and I, went to see the show. In other words, I didn't have that experience with his earlier albums, and I didn't have it with the next one, Off the Ground, which he released in '93. I can't really say that one did much for me, but the next one he did, Flaming Pie. That has a unique combination of Beatles nostalgia due to the Anthology project, which came out around the same time, and also the heavy cloud, of his wife's terminal illness hanging over everything. So, a lot of the material on that album has an emotional depth to it that you just don't find on much of his other work. It might be my favorite Paul McCartney solo album, Flaming Pie.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of fans. It really was a return to form. There seems to be a pattern that he tends to. He'll put out something really great. It'll be followed by something good or mediocre. It's got like a sort of a cyclical pattern to it. And every once in a while, Flaming Pie would be one of the higher regarded ones that he found new inspiration, I think, from working with George and Ringo on the Anthology project and the Beatles cuts. And Ringo they actually did a co-write on Flaming Pie, as well as Steve Miller and James McCartney's on there, his son.
Yeah.
And it was the last album he did in Linda's lifetime as well.
Some of those songs were written for her with the thought in mind that she might not be around much longer. It's a unique moment in time. He still did his, put on a brave face and smile and sing a happy song kind of thing, but there was an undercurrent, that was unmistakable, and I think it added. And then Little Willow, I believe, was a Maureen Starkey tribute.
Yes.
And
I was going to say that was another aspect of mortality about that album, is that that was one of the original Beatle wives that died young.
Yeah, that's a magnificent recording. I mean, musically, his vocal performance, the vocal harmonies, the production on it. I mean, that's right at the top if I had to have a short list of favorite Paul McCartney tracks. And there again, it's because it's about something real. It isn't about Eskimos and Junior Farm or. I used to smile when I was a pup, sailing down the Nile in a china cup with a recipe for a lovely day sticking out of my back pocket. I'm pretty sure that never happened. I'm pretty sure that's a bunch of words that flow off the tongue. In 2001, he puts out Driving Rain, his Heather Mills album, which proved to have the staying power of his marriage to Heather Mills.
Right.
And a pretty forgettable song collection, in my opinion. Now, I also saw that tour, and I can tell you that whenever he played a song from that album, you could just feel the energy in the room just drain and fizzle to nothing. It would be Hello, Goodbye, and it would be Getting Better, which he never performed before. And everybody be jazzing. He goes, And now something from the new album, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's go for a drive. And it was a palpable thing. And people weren't doing it on purpose. They're just like going, okay, we're going to stand here for 4 minutes until you play something else we like. Which is kind of sad, but, that is the reality of it. His next two albums, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard and Memory Almost Full, were certainly much better than Driving Rain. And his latest album, New, has some interesting things on it. It was where he worked with a variety of producers. So similar to what we did with Ringo, what's a lesser-known solo McCartney track that you want to put the spotlight on?
Well, I go back to the first post-Beatles year, 1971, where he put out two albums in a very short space of time. Ram came out in May, and then Wings' debut album, Wildlife, came out at the end of the year. So there's roughly 6 months separating them in completely different approaches. Here, arguably, people could say he was still sort of flailing around trying to find a musical direction post-Beatles. He'd done the half-baked album for his debut, and then he did the full-on, all-out production with Ram. And now he's starting up this, as he called it, the Skiffle Band with Denny Lane and Denny Sywell, Wings. And he made it his goal, because apparently he'd read somewhere that Bob Dylan made an album in a week, so I'm going to try that approach. And so, some of the stuff is just jams. The most fully formed material on an album was actually outtakes from Ram. And the song I'm picking is Dear Friend. Now, in the context of the time, this was now just a couple of months after John had issued that utter character assassination, How Do You Sleep, on the Imagine album.
Yeah.
And it's got George playing on it. And so the world is waiting, wow, Paul, how are you going to respond to that? That's really nasty stuff. Notwithstanding the fact that John's insult had been prompted by too many people on Ram, too many people preaching practices, slightly more veiled insult hurled his way. But so people looked at Dear Friend as his response to How Do You Sleep? And it has that sort of vibe to it. The thing that I've never been able to determine to my satisfaction is, did he rewrite the words? Because the song was recorded before How Do You Sleep was.
Oh.
But you can see it in the context, certainly with all the bad relations going on, the breakdown in the friendships, and now, he's taking the other three to court. You can see where he would want to offer something conciliatory, sort of put a public face on the fact that I know what looks like I'm doing to you guys in court looks really bad, but really, let's get this business garbage out of the way and go back to being friends if we can. And so it has that wistful sort of hopefulness to it, hearkening back to the friendship that was there at the beginning before they conquered the world. So I think it's a nice little song to really kind of bear himself in a way that Paul doesn't typically tend to do, in wanting to be this conciliator at that point.
Well, it's another good choice, and I'll be honest and say, out of the whole Paul catalog, I would have not expected Robert Rodriguez to go Wildlife. It's almost kind of a forgotten thing. It's like, he doesn't acknowledge it in his live set or anything, but Dear Friend, definitely, the highlight of it. I mean, that's the era when he was doing Mary Had a Little Lamb. Come on, Paul.
Mumbo, bip bop.
Exactly. But yeah, Dear Friend, that is an overlooked one because of the context surrounding it. And like you say, it was of its time. So let's let people listen and decide if they think it's a response to John from, did you say 71 or 70?
71.
Yeah, that's right. It was after Ram. Yeah, it had to be. Okay. 1971, here's Paul McCartney with Dear Friend.
Dear friend, what's the time? Is this really the borderline? Does it really mean so much to you? Are you afraid? Are What's the time? Is this really the borderline? Does it really mean so much to you? Are you afraid? Or is it true? Different. Throw the wine. I'm in love with a friend of mine. Really, truly, young and newlywed. Are you a fool? Or is it true? Or is it true?
All right, well, I'm glad you picked that one. Another inspired choice. For my own selection, I'm going to Memory Almost Full. I can see how someone who heard the Dance Tonight single might have just assumed that, the entire album sucked, because that was a pretty innocuous tune, which I did not care for at all. But apart from that one, ironically, the album is actually very good. Some people even gone so far as to compare a certain sequence of tracks to be on par with the Abbey Road medley, though I wouldn't go quite that far myself. No, but he had some songs that ran together, kind of reminded people of the Abbey Road medley. But my honorable mentions for Paul would be things like "Check My Machine" from McCartney 2, just because of how nutty it is. It's kind of like a "You Know My Name, Look Up the Number" kind of thing, just an oddball track. I mentioned "Flowers in the Dirt." I mean, any Rough Ride, Distractions, "That Day Is Done," some of the best lyrics I've heard on a Paul McCartney album. So people who don't know that album, dig into it. There's a track on New called "Appreciate" that I came really close to playing. It's just a 71-year-old guy putting out a track like that. It was a really cool track. People should go listen to that. But the one I decided to go with is a moody little number from his 2007 Memory Almost Full album. This is called "House of Wax."